Welcome to the LGBTQ comics and social activism panel for WonderCon. I'm really excited to have everyone here, some of my favorite people in the world. I'm really excited to get into this conversation. My name is Justin Hall. I'm a cartoonist. I've been working in comics since 2001, and I've been super gay the entire time, so I've been making queer comics for the whole time. I'm a professor. I teach comics at the California College of the Arts in the MFA in Comics program, and done history work around queer comics and community building work, which we'll get into as well. But I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel here. Oh, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And let's go on to the next person here. So Lawrence.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Lindell, a cartoonist based in the Bay Area, but I'm from Southern California. I run a kind of archival collective project called TheBAYlies, based in the Bay Area for queer cartoonists and cartoonists of color. And I run a small press in the Bay Area with my wife called Laneha House. And yeah, also queer, that's why I'm on the panel. But unlike Justin, I haven't been queer the whole time, or at least I wasn't open about it, so yeah.
My name is Tara Madison Avery. I'm the publisher of Stack Deck Press. I'm also a cartoonist and editor. Upcoming projects will include the polyamory coloring and activity book and an art book based on a series of illustrations by Awan Nance, the 1001 Black Men series. I'm also working on a couple of projects of my own. I have a series of stories called Mightier about the intersections of polyamorousness, queerness, and other chaotic influences in the Los Angeles area, and also a little bit about recent events called You Are Not Essential.
Hi everyone, my name is Anand Vedawala. I am a kindergarten teacher in San Francisco Unified School District. I'm also the executive director of San Francisco Zine Fest. That is how I know a lot of you. And currently I live in Oakland with my partner, and we've been here for a few months now, though I've been in the Bay Area for over 10 years. And right now, a lot of my focus has been about writing about queer South Asians and writing picture books about people of color.
I'm Jennifer Camper. I'm a cartoonist, and my work deals with being queer, being female, being mixed, Arab American. I also edit anthologies, and I've organized countless queer comics events, including the Queers in Comics Conference. And I'm just thrilled to be here.
Hi, I'm Trinidad Escobar. I am a cartoonist from Milpitas, California, but I was in Oakland for about 10 years and recently came back to do some work here based on Milpitas. So I'm working on little cornfields as like kind of my ongoing side project while I work on my bigger graphic novel of Sea and Venom, which is about decolonization and headhunters in the 1500s, South Pacific, and queerness in Asia. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you all. Heading to speaker mode now. So my first question, so there's lots of different ways to approach social activism while making comics, while making art in general. One of the first things that just occurs to me with queer cartoonists in particular is just the very fact of existing as a sort of act of resistance, because we're meant to not exist for the majority of our history. So I'm wondering about this idea of simply creating stories that are personal than being a sort of political act. There's the phrase "personal is political," which was popularized by Carol Hanisch in 1970, but she denies authorship of that phrase, and nobody has taken it on. Basically, it's sort of understood to be come out of the community organically. And it was used for feminist discourse it still is to this day. And I just love the phrase. I think it's really wonderful. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about this idea, the personal being political, and how that might affect your work and show up in your work.
I came up with that quote, actually. No, seriously, yeah. So when you're queer, you're basically sharing a variety of life, a way of living that a big portion, perhaps 90% or greater portion of the population is unfamiliar with, and they're in a position where they can elect political representatives or contribute or participate in activism contrary to queer goals and queer well-being. So yes, by communicating to people who are not in the know about who we are basically engaged in the political act of preserving our own well-being and promoting understanding.
There is this thing about just existing and being visible that is very important. At least it has been for me. And I think a lot of queer folks can also identify with that. Just being able to be someone who looks like you, who thinks like you, who maybe feels towards others the way you do. I remember when I first came out to my cousin, one of my cousins at age 18, her reaction was, I didn't think Indian people could be gay. And I was like, that's, but it was true. It was true. And I didn't realize for the longest time that maybe, oh, me having feelings for another boy at the time in high school meant that maybe I was queer. Maybe I wasn't straight. And I think that was part of because I never saw anyone who was queer and South Asian being portrayed in the media that I was consuming, whether I was seeing on TV or in the movies or being taught about in school. So yes, our existence is very important, and in a way it is political and it is revolutionary just to be visible and be alive right now.
I agree with that. I feel like because we live in a culture where the media and the arts are we're so inundated with the media and the arts that it's really important for people to get validation. And when those of us who grow up without seeing ourselves in stories, in TV shows, in comics, it's very missed. And like a lot of people, I drew comics to tell the stories that I wanted to read and that I wasn't finding out there. I feel like our stories are not being told unless we do it ourselves. And so we're doing it almost for ourselves. We are our own first readers. And I think that's a really important part of making this kind of work.
I just want to add to the idea that like queer folks didn't exist in certain cultures, like in Asian cultures or in Southeast Asian cultures, because queerness or being out is sometimes akin to being whitewashed, westernized, or Americanized. That this idea of queerness came from the influence of the West and imperialism and colonization. When in the Philippines, which is a Catholic country, there's no research into queer histories. It just doesn't exist. And anything that comes out queer and is trying to, become canon and is trying to establish its place as legitimate is automatically seen as Western and not of us, and that's really damaging to Filipinos in the diaspora, Filipinos in America who are trying to find home in the Philippines and also try to establish this American identity. It does a lot of breaking of the spirit when you're told like, nah, your identity isn't real and didn't exist, and what you're experiencing now is like this poison. So making of Sea and Venom, which takes place partially in the 1500s, I have to make up a lot of what I think queerness looks like, what it might have looked like based on certain cultures that existed at the time. And I already feel the heat coming. I already feel like a lot of the activists and my own people coming for me, because it's going to be not that this huge wave is going to come at me like this book is this huge thing, but we don't have queer graphic novels like on a larger scale in the Philippines, and this is going to be released in the Philippines as well. So I already feel some of the like pressure for myself to get it right. But what is right now, except to tell my experience, do a little research and do the best that I can. So it's deeply personal, deeply political.
So there's so many different issues that come up with all those answers that I really want to dig into. One of the, so a few of you talked about the idea of representation and being really important when you can sort of see yourself, right? I think about Alison Bechdel talking about when she created Dykes to Watch Out For, that she wanted to make lesbians visible, and that was her goal. And so many people, I think so many queer people saw themselves reflected in the panels of her comics. And I think that's true for all of our work, kind of moving forward. But there's also, representation is complicated, right? And there's even some pitfalls at times for it, with it. I think about Ramsey Fawaz talking about how that you can get too obsessed with sort of perfect representation, that if you're always kind of waiting for yourself to be exactly mirrored, you're always going to be dissatisfied, right? And I think about my own, I love the X-Men when I was growing up, right? And the one sort of gay character, openly gay character that was presented to me as North Star, I was not interested in, but I was interested in Storm. Like, she spoke to me, right? So who you connect with, what other kind of characters you connect with, or what stories you connect with might not match exactly the mirroring aspect. So if you guys could talk about maybe how representation matters and also its sort of limitations.
When we were growing up, and a lot of the comics that we were reading didn't have any direct representation, and even X-Men for the most part was sort of very much a grand metaphor. It wasn't, they never really came out and said it, although it was, from 75 on, it was clear that the metaphor was the anti-queer hate, and what have you. But when there's no representation, even bad representation is a step up. And I say this right now, and he's hardly the most sensitive and sensitive person that's concerned with the most noblest social justice concerns. But Howard Chaykin's presentation of every presentation of gender non-conforming individuals in his books, they're always villains. They're always horrible people. Like, there was the Nazi who was a cross-dresser, and but it was absolutely a drop dead knockout, and and just like, wow, that's fascinating. Am I in that, or the transgender vampire or wannabe in Black Kiss or whatever? All these people were horrible people, but it's like, that's something in there. There's something in there that's about me, or that I can connect with, and you get fascinated with. You look forward to the next opportunity for him to tell you you're a horrible person. So, and it's funny.
I think growing up, not even queer representation, but just like, again, as a South Asian, there isn't much representation in American media. So Apu, of course, on The Simpsons. I remember my dad one time calling me out and saying, like, why are you watching this? There's some offensive jokes in it that he thought that he believed they were inappropriate. And my defense was, there's an Indian person on here. And I was like, that's why I'm watching it. Look, there's one of us, and he has a store. Like, he has his own business. Look at, isn't that amazing? And of course, now as an adult, I'm like, this person is very problematic. Also, he's not voiced by a South Asian person. And of course, now as I've gotten older, I've learned much more about all of that about Apu and how actually harmful his representation is and can be. But when you're an immigrant, like I was when I first moved here, I mean, I still am, and you just want to see, you're amazed that there is a version of you on the screen. And especially in American culture, where we are meant to see white male as the default, where every background, every race is supposed to identify with the representation. So like with the white person and their feelings in movies and TV shows. So if we watch a movie with Black characters, we're like, oh, that's a Black film. But it's, if you watch this with like Latinx characters, it's like, oh, that's that kind of film. But with the white main character, we're all supposed to just identify. It's like, of course you should be able to relate to this. And I think that's where a lot of straight audiences have an issue when there's a queer character where they're like, how can I identify with this? That's not me. And I'm like, wait, I, as a person of color and as a queer person, I've identified with straight folks, with white folks, people who didn't look like me this whole time. I think you should also be able to do it. These are characterizations. And I'm speaking of like queer South Asians, I can't remember any right now, if there were any in media.
One thing that Jen mentioned earlier about that queer comics being made by queer people for queer people, sort of, and it makes me it brings up this question of who is your audience, right? And Lawrence, one of the things that I find really remarkable about your comics is that they feel like both authentic to your, obviously to your voice and sort of speaking to your own community, but also something that would be accessible to broader communities as well, like especially when you're talking about issues around mental health or queerness or, I mean, all these different issues. So how do you think of your audience? Like, do you think about kind of talking to your own community? Do you think about being able to sort of educate beyond that? Is that part of a social activism goal of your art?
Yeah, usually I'm talking to myself first, especially regarding my queer comics is usually kind of helping myself to accept this or acknowledging that I have a right to be queer, because that was always my issue. It's like, well, I'm bi, the person I'm in a relationship with, we look like a straight couple. Do I have a right to be queer? Do I have a right to talk about this queerness? What does that look like? How do I relate that to people that know I'm proud to be queer? Just because I don't look queer doesn't, like, and what does queer look like? Um, and so it starts as this conversation that people are also having with themselves. I meet a lot of young Black bi people at shows, and they're kind of like, hey, that's me too, or I grew up in the church too. And so I never think of myself as an activist, more of I'm just kind of living my life. And like you were saying earlier, it's like being yourself is a political act, which is ridiculous, but it is. Um, and so that's how I approach my work. And then I'm like, well, I see this is working. Maybe I can use this as a way to talk to my family. Maybe I can use this as a way to talk to my community, because pictures work. It's not too hard to read. Um, I'm educated, but I don't have that vast of a vocabulary because I have my own. Well, you were how I feel about English and the things that English has done to certain people and making us feel certain ways when we don't speak. I have a lot of, yeah. So I'm like, well, I could write it in a way I know people understand, and it's me. Like, I wish I had my comics when I was younger, and then to realize that there were comics from people like me that just weren't promoted and I didn't have access to. So I'm trying to make sure that everyone has access to this information type of thing. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Actually, that leads me to a question with Jen was talking about the creation of the Queers in Comics conference, and one of the things a disclosure, I helped in some of those as well, but it was Jen's brainchild, and one of the things that was such a sort of project goal, I think, for us was to create intergenerational conversations between different, building coalitions between different kinds of queer identities, different generations that look at queerness differently and queer identities differently. So Jen, if you could talk about that goal for your community building work in comics.
There's so much to say. Yeah, so basically, Queers in Comics Conference and really all the community events that I've organized have been just because I wanted to get a bunch of cartoonists together and have a party. And I needed a way to have that happen. And by couching it in some sort of event, it would bring us all together in a room. And so the conference was a way to get hundreds of LGBTQ cartoonists together for a few days. And we had all these panels, but like in comics, it's what happens between the panels that to me is the most exciting. And I wanted people to meet other people that they didn't know, see the friends they did know, get inspired, realize who has been inspired by their work. And like Justin was saying, I wanted to get people of different generations to interact and to be influenced by each other. And, we had a lot of good parties.
Lawrence, I do remember you talking about it was inspirational for you to meet someone like Rupert Kennard, who had been doing work by about out Black characters from the 1970s.
Yeah, it was. That's kind of what I was talking about. It's just like, even though he's gay and I'm bi, it's still like, that would have helped me be like, oh, I can do this. It's okay. Like, there's a space for me here, and then also there's space to talk about my personal experience with queerness. And he opened that door, but then how am I a Black cartoonist and I don't have access to this information that this stuff exists? And I got my master's. Like, if it wasn't for certain teachers putting that in the classroom, I would have just been out there like, well, it's just me. Like, like this is ridiculous. Yeah, that Prism Comics is very important. It was very important to be able to meet him. It worked, Jen, like what you set out to accomplish, you really did accomplish, because now I get to take Rupert and bring him back to a whole sea of Black kids that are like, what? 1970? You could be queer in 1970? Which we don't talk about James Baldwin, Audre Lorde. Like, there's all these queer heroes we have that are kind of not. Once they become something else to someone else, the queerness kind of goes away. And it's like, well, they're just Black. And it's like, no, they're Black and they're queer, because I'm Black and I'm queer, so you can't just erase that. And yeah, it's a tangent, but that's what comics I'm trying to accomplish. Like, hey, please hear my voice, please hear our voice. We have stories to tell that include all this type of Blackness, that includes queerness, because it's always overlapped. And yeah, so
one of the things also I was thinking about this sort of generational stuff, and then how do we talk about different generations' experiences? And Trinidad, you're doing historical comics that deal with queerness. I just did a series of historical pieces about queer San Francisco, and one of the things is that you were alluding to this earlier, that identities sort of shift, and the way we talk about them shifts, language shifts, and how to get that into a comic is really complicated, right? You're dealing with both words and images. For example, one of the terms that a lot of gender nonconforming folks and trans people back in the 60s would use in San Francisco was a hair fairy. I'd never heard that term until I discovered it, right? Kind of doing this research. But how does that then translate? I can't just use that term when I'm doing a sort of modern comic. So Trinidad, how do you deal with that stuff? And I also want to hear from Tara about this too, because you do a lot of historical work. How do you both sort of deal with the changing language around queer identities when you're doing historical work?
Oh, that's such a big question, Justin.
I only ask big questions.
I have coffee sweats. Okay, so just to take some of that and step back a little bit, I'm careful about making clear that Of Sea and Venom is inspired by history and is not a historical comic, only because I put so much fantasy into it, because I see fantasy as like technology for decolonization, right? I don't have a real connection to the motherland. I wasn't raised there. Even folks who are raised there don't necessarily have any ties to indigeneity anymore, So I'm completely removed. And this was my entryway into imagining with the material that's available. So it is inspired by history. I have no idea what kinds of words were used back then to describe people, to describe a queer experience. What I do know is that some words have survived over the centuries and weren't, changed into Spanish or anglicized. So those few words give us insight as to how people think, or how the psychology of a people was back then. So what I can gather is that that polyamory existed, that trans identities and non-binary identities were third, fourth, and fifth genders, and that sex did not equate to romance or marriage, that women and femme people were allowed to have sex with other people that they weren't necessarily going to marry, and they were they were raised to copulate and reproduce, right? But that didn't mean that they had to marry someone based on gender or sex, right? So there's a lot of like really big information that I get to work with. And then in that creation, I get to make up the words. And I have only recently given myself permission to do that. I felt so scared, like, I need to find the right words. I need to make sure that my great, great, great ancestors are represented well. I need to make sure that I don't disappoint the historians back, at the museums in the Philippines. I'm like thinking real big about myself in this way, right? But really the story is so small. I'd rather explore the truth of what it feels like to really search for that element of identity, rather than let me show you how to get it right, because I don't know how to get it right. So I'm okay stumbling in front of people through my books right now. And in doing so, creating some language that we can use.
Yeah, that's the language is fascinating, because a lot of the terms that we're very comfortable with today didn't exist 40, 50, 100 years ago. So when you're looking through the past for people who you might find instructive or inspirational for a polyamorous experience, a trans experience, etc., you're going to come up short, because they just didn't understand it that way then. And the question always is this sort of the strong version of the superior wharf hypothesis? It doesn't work until you put a name on it and delimit it from other things. I don't think that's true. I think that it really is, you find examples, as you said, of polyamory, of queerness, of gender nonconformity and trans experience, but they just didn't call it that then. Where the language influence may come in is that it might not sort of be plugged into a system of connotations where it's deemed pejorative. But just in terms of history and seeking out things, I make the historical LGBTQ coloring books, and the polyamory book is sort of the next entry in that. And the thing is to sort of plunge into the past and find some sort of, for my purposes anyway, not for everybody's purposes, is to find high profile individuals, people we know that have had some sort of influence on our lives, that and that also represent different segments of the community, in terms of orientation and ethnicity, that you can sort of bring to light and say, this person is an example of this phenomenon today. In the transgender heroes coloring book, I included perhaps not a hero, but a historical figure, Elagabalus, who was one of the most spectacularly incompetent Roman emperors we ever had, but was also perhaps the only real reigning Roman empress by today's standards. If you were to look at Elagabalus, this is a woman of trans experience, but has to lead a religion and an empire in a male role, and is not taking that second part very seriously at all. So, of course, assassinated before the age of 18, and the empire moved on. But we do know now that, hey, we can rise to the highest levels of power as long as we don't run afoul of any knives.
Anand, you also illustrated a book about sort of a fictionalized history of a Black family in the United States. So that also obviously is about doing this sort of historical research and trying to figure out, but it's specifically from the visual side of it. So talk to us about that. Like, how did you think about history in a visual context?
Part of that actually came about because of just all that was happening in 2014, 2015 in our country, just all the violence that we were seeing now, like filmed and completely still ignored, that was being acted upon the Black community. And a friend of mine, another friend named Lawrence, who now lives in Southern California, and he and I, we had both gone to Academy of Art University, and we said, well, we talk about there not being works about people of color by people of color. We both went to school for this. We can write this, we can put this out, and we need to say something, because this has been happening for centuries and it continues even now. And it's frustrating. We need to somehow get this out. And at the same time, we had seen an infographic about children's books that was about like how many characters are of color and how many characters are white and all of that. And at the time, I think the statistic we had seen, the infographic we had seen, was from 2012, where it was like 91% are white characters. And I'm like, that's not okay. So we decided to write the book, and I had read this book, Spoon River Anthology, which came out in 1915. in high school, we were made to read it, and I loved it because it was fictionalized, but it's from the perspective of the townspeople. And it's little prose poetry like that you read a page of, and then through it you find out about the secrets of the town, the gossiping and all that, what actually happened and it's all from the perspective of the townspeople after they've passed away. It's their epitaphs that they themselves had written. So we took a similar approach and decided to illustrate it and to kind of highlight the injustices that the Black community has been experiencing, like for, let's say, just the past 100 years. So we went from 1915 to 2015. It ended up being, of course, a lot of research because we're trying to fit 100 years into a short little book that we wanted to get out within 3 months, which hindsight, not a great idea when you're doing that. And part of it was just learning, just finding out about lots of things. Like, for example, like finding out, like, then back in 2015 that, oh, Portland, like Oregon, was founded as a white utopia, that it wasn't meant to have any Black people in it. So then when they finally opened the borders and people went in, they did not experience safety or anything as you would expect. And part of it was also how, as a non-Black writer, I'm South Asian. So then as Lawrence and I were co-writing this, I told him, I'm like, Lawrence, you have to be a part of this project, first of all. Like, we have to write this together. And he did all the illustrations for it and came up with this concept for it. But it was also, how do I represent this accurately? How do I make it respectful? Because I'm someone who is not part of the community now, writing about the community. And we had some characters who talked about being kids of slaves. And it was like, how do we approach the language? And I think part of it was just like, nope, I'm just going to write it as I would if it was a person talking about themselves now. But the things they are talking about are a little bit different. And at the end, it was about a family surviving and persevering. And part of that name was 100 years from now, the name is 100 years from now, our bones will be different. And that was also intentional because we want to say, well, our bones will be different because they will have experienced so much. The world is still going to be a terrible place. Unfortunately, we weren't very optimistic.
That's the spirit. It does seem like, there's dealing with historical comics, there's sort of two things happening at once. Like on the one hand, you have to remain true to the actual brutality of the past and to the actual, systems of oppression and the language that was used and to a certain extent that, to keep people down and weaponized language and all this sort of, all the different weapons that oppression, that oppressors were able to use on marginalized people throughout history, but at the same time also give those people agency, right? So that there's always been resistance. There's always been people sort of fighting back against these systems of oppression, and we also have to pay homage to that in a real way. So it's sort of for me at least, dealing with historical comics, there's like you got to be truthful about how horrible it was, but then also about how powerful the resistance actually was. We don't want to take away agency from our ancestors, right? One of the things I was also thinking about, there's more, you're talking about sort of almost like a magical realism sort of construct here, right? Where you're doing these sort of epitaphs of this family as a way to construct their story. And Trinidad had also mentioned earlier about how she's been using elements of magical realism and horror, I know in your comics as well. So I'm wondering about how you bring, how some of you as creators bring genre concerns into your work, right? Jen has done a lot of this horror work as well, and humor, of course, as well. Like, how do you bring in, besides just being sort of like memoir comics and straight up personal as political, how do you bring in other genres to help construct a social agenda in your work?
I think we're all looking for a community and a tribe. And, for myself, when I looked at work by women, I find that most of the stuff is very heterosexual. And then I would look at the queer stuff and it would be very white. And then I would try and find Arabs, and either they were, villains or non-existent. And so in a way, the idea that there's queer female who are mongrel Arab American and have that perspective, which is mine, is almost like magical realism in a way. It's like I'm creating this world that has my values and my perspective, and I'm positing it that as normal for the reader. And then I can throw that into any kind of story I want. So I can do a horror story, but from my perspective, or I can do a romance, but from my perspective. And, and it's just given that, yes, there's queers and there's queers of color and there's transgender people and there's, this whole world that's the world that I live in and my perspective. And then I just sort of fold that over, hopefully good storytelling. And I force the reader to live in my mind in a way. And I think that's the power of storytelling and the power of comics, is that you make the reader look at the world through your own vision. And that's, the power of art and how art can be a really constant force for change.
I'll just add really quickly that like when I do all my journaling and I try to just get a lot of stuff out, I come to realize like that very often my initial way of entering a story is like structuring it and being very like, I'm going to plot things out, I'm going to plug things in, and it's like real gross and boring. And the good stuff comes after you get all that out of the way. And you're like, okay, I'm not going to try to be a good Filipino horror writer. There's so many of us. There's like, it's everything, right? And so I'm like, what do my favorite Filipino authors do? They take elements that are naturally horrific from their lives and then build on that. And so something that I kind of went over in my head when I made a comic called Casey and Juliet, which is about a queer aswang or a vampire that appears after a meetup. So back in the 90s for Filipinos, like people were down. They didn't say like, I'm gay, I'm bi. In the Bay Area, it was I'm down, like DOWNE. And that was like code for I'm queer. But there was always a risk, right? So like, we all know that like that fear of like, I don't know if this person is queer or not. I don't know how this is going to really go down. And so upon meeting someone, instead of that fear being, am I going to get jumped? Is someone going to hurt me? Now you get to be scared about other things. You're going to be scared about whether or not this thing is going to turn into a vampire. Because I feel like our fears, valid and real and scary, have been shown for all the world to see, and I'd like to see us be able to be scared of other things. So I take that element and think about like what would be the scariest thing besides getting hurt back then. What would be the scariest freaking thing? Oh, if I hooked up with some like hella fine like player and I think things are gonna go good and something goes down. So yeah, that's just an example of how I might approach genre.
Great, Trinidad. Now it feels like you're not afraid of enough things. Please be afraid of more things. That is what you're doing.
Well, regarding genre, from my own side, I missed my opportunity about 10 or 13 years ago to be one of the fat white ladies who writes vampire novels and becomes a millionaire from them. I could have been the trans Stephanie Meyer or Anne Rice. Anne Rice isn't even fat anymore, so she can't write any vampire novels either. But seriously, I think that the powerful thing about commercial genres, we talk about, like horror, detective, romantic comedy, superhero, whatever, is that there's usually, the traditional literary theory says, well, these are commercial genres, they come with their own rules and people can't do creative work within them. They can only work within, mechanized guidelines to create product for. That's not true. I mean, what these genres are often very good at doing is identifying conflicts in the world and sort of putting them in motion, in some sort of metaphorical or allegorical mode. And you look at and and putting queer folks in these things often changes the people's understanding of them. So, you know, a queer romantic comedy isn't simply just a romantic comedy with queer characters in it. It can also, you know, bring into play conflicts that don't exist in straight relationships. You know, being out, you know, finding community, things like that. Like a queer superhero, you know, the whole notion of a secret identity takes on a double meaning if you have a queer superhero where orientation is a danger, and also moral responsibility is another superhero thing. You know, there's the quote, you know, of course, you know, you have the genres of elimination and the genres of communion, etc. But yeah, I think that that genre can be exploited to great extent to describe the queer experience in ways that also are proven to entertain.
Yeah, it's like not just queering characters, but queering genre itself, which is really amazing.
I wanted to add just two things about that. And that one, I think a lot of us come from a self-publishing background. And I think because of that, we all have the freedom to explore and blend genres as much as we want. And that has been really helpful in helping us, well, blend whatever we want. And the second thing I want to say is that I think a lot of times, especially for folks who are coming to terms with their identities or exploring their identities, especially in my case, I feel like there is so much trauma and experience that I need to unpack that I kind of buffer it with humor or with another layer genre that just helps me talk about the trauma itself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another sort of comic, a social activism comic I want to touch upon is this idea of sort of maybe applied comics, however you want to talk about it, but basically comics with a specific purpose, right? So I did recently a public health comic. I was hired by a public health organization to do some comics around queer health. And I know some of you have done this sort of thing. Like it could be anything from like doing, you know, murals, comics murals for specific purposes, or working with specific nonprofit organizations or activism groups. So I was wondering if some of you could talk about that experience as opposed to the sort of more self-expressive creative work that you do as well.
Comics are a really powerful tool because I think people come to comics with their defenses down because it's words and pictures, and people have this, you know, memory of comics from childhood, or they think that they're going to be funny, or it's somehow thought of as an easy art form, a very accessible art form. You can pack in some really powerful messages that people will be sometimes more open to in a comics format. That said, there's also the problem of something that would be written somehow becomes more more powerful when it's drawn. And so some ideas become, you know, really scary to people when they see it in a picture format as opposed to just simply words. So I think comics are this, you know, really interesting tool as when used as a way to communicate complicated, sometimes dangerous ideas. And I mean, I think we all struggle with how to do that effectively. And, you know, so sometimes the reactions, the negative reactions, are just as satisfying to me because I feel like I've struck a chord. If someone's getting mad at my comics, then, you know, maybe I've done my job.
And when we're talking about applied comics, comics have like the advantage of images. You know, like I mean, we think about like an instruction manual to put together a piece of furniture or something. That's basically a comic. You know, sort of that. You know, imagine. You know, you could, if you had to had a prose booklet to tell you how to assemble a couch, it'd be a nightmare. You know, and so the images have the power to do things to directly demonstrate something that words can only sort of talk around. You know, and it's sort of a, and I think that that's you know, true with you know, showing people, you know, sharing people's lives, sharing details about people's lives as well. That is something that can be instructive. Where, you know, my favorite thought experiment is like the difference between prose and English is like, as you say, here's a sentence. Jill gave James an ironic look. Now, write your own version of that sentence. Then okay, now Jill gave James an ironic look. Draw it. You know, which which tells you more, which requires more work? I think it's probably number two, but it does give you more of a more accurate picture of what's going on. And I think that's the instructive power, both in technical and personal matters.
I wanted to actually wrap up with, and thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. I could talk to you all for like 5 hours easily. So, but I wanted to also talk about community building, and we've touched upon it a few other times. Jen was talking about the Queers in Commerce conference and other community work she's done, and Lawrence with Linnea House, and Anand with Zine Fest, and Tara with Stack Deck Press. And can you talk about sort of like how you think about building community through comics and pursuing social activism through that sort of community building?
My goal right now is to try not to repeat myself too much, because there's always more stuff going on. You know, there's always more of a community to represent and to actively push for the new thing. And you know, we're living in a time right now where everybody's lives are changing, and that means queers' lives are changing too. And you know, we need to seek out, you know, the new challenges we have, the new ways of living. You know, as Trinidad has said, you know, we don't have to worry about getting beat up quite as much as we used to, although we still do. But you know, life presents other challenges with us. You know, with respectability comes respectable problems, and so I think that you know, building on what has come before and just sort of mapping out our own future with our work.
What you just said was like my whole purpose of starting TheBAYlies was to build on what came before, instead of being like, all right, it's my time, where TheBAYlies is that's not good for anything. I'm just building on what Prism Comics was already doing. Like, I want it to be a direct connection to what everyone on the panel right now is doing. It's like, I'm a part of that, not I'm separate from it. It's like, this is the reason I get to do this. And maybe I'll be the reason someone else gets to do that. And then the history is so important, because knowledge really, like, it's corny, but it's like knowledge is power, but it really is. Like, having access to these things changes people's lives more than most people know. And I'm not talking about comics, I mean just regular people, which I think we're regular too, but we just happen to be able to draw. But like regular people, it's changing things in ways that people don't know it's happening. And I see firsthand of what that little comic did for some little Black kid that now doesn't have to wonder, like, is it okay for me to be here? Still wondering, like, it's 2021 and they're still wondering, am I okay to be here? So it's like, that's the purpose of, I want to give roses, and then I want to bring, I don't know, I just want people to feel like I can be here. Still, it's still what the main thing is I'm focusing on. And it's not, you're human, you can be here because you're human, but you're human. And also people have laid the work that they tried to kind of erase, that you don't even know people fought for you to yeah, I just want to give access back. So community, that's community to me. Connecting everyone outside of comics, because comics is tricky, which I'm learning. Is like, some stuff I don't understand, and I don't know how to navigate that, because I'm just like, hey, don't do that. We don't do that. And then it's like, well, this is comics. And it's like, no, that's, so I'm figuring that out. So I'm trying to continue that kind of DIY punk underground zine of, we don't need the permission, we never needed it. And people are here that been saying that since the beginning. How do we get back to that type of thing?
What Lauren said was so important, that we have a responsibility, because somebody paved the way for us. And I'm only able to do what I'm able to do because somebody else broke ground. And so it's my responsibility to break ground for the next person through the door. And I feel like in some ways we all are small level gatekeepers, and wherever we have the chance to bring other people along with us, it's not only important, it's just a joy to do.
One of the things, like, to add to what Jen and Lawrence also said, it's like one of the joys of running San Francisco Zine Fest, just having now the platform, the opportunity to provide a space for people to then tell their own stories. because it could just be me and the other 4 organizers like, you know what, let's just make it about us. No one else. It wouldn't be that great. I don't think 5,000 people would attend that. But the joy is in seeing so many amazing artists from all sorts of different backgrounds, like telling their stories, sharing their work, and inspiring the thousands of people who come through those doors. I wouldn't have met, growing up, you see a representation of queer folks in one way, especially in like media, and you're like, okay, this is all there is. But then you actually meet like kindred spirits at festivals, at Comic Cons, at Zine Fest, all sorts of expos. And that helps us build community. I mean, that really does. And I'm thankful I get to continue that forward and help other people create that space for others as well.
I just wanted to add that because of Queers in Comics and all the other really amazing festivals and comic book festivals, I've been able to connect with people that I don't think I would have ever met. So something interesting that has happened is with some of the like journalistic comics I've put out there, I've gotten, you know, feedback and people coming to talk to me at these cons in person. And I'll hear, you know, like, I never heard of anything like this before. I've never read anything like this before. And it made me feel seen, or like, you didn't do a good enough job. So I'll get one of those. But one of the one of the really miraculous things that has happened is I met 2 family members that I'd never met before. We didn't know that we were family. So, and you know, a lot of POC families, we have huge families. On my mom's side alone, just my adoptive mom's side, I have 60 cousins just on that side. And so I was like, one day I'm going to meet more of them. I don't know how. And so something that happened was a professor directed someone to my table at San Francisco Zine Fest and was like, this person's working on their PhD. They're confronting some queer issues in their own families, and they'd like to talk to you. And I got to talk to them. We found out we're first cousins, that we never met, and we're talking about the same family. That's magic, man. I love comics. So it's healing, and it's hard work, and I couldn't do any of this without community.
I can't think of a better place to leave it. Can I also say I love comics and I love our community and I love all of you. You were like my heroes and my role models, and I'm just so like, you know, internally grateful that we have this amazing community. So thank you all for doing this and for talking so openly and passionately about your work. Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you all.
All right. Take care.
Bye.